Okay, so let's go over the recent 20th century history. So, as covered in the podcast, I would encourage you to listen to the Trade Show podcast before this lecture. There is this switch in theory about trade that happens in the 20th century, where essentially liberalization, or what's commonly known as free trade, is popularized and mainstreamed. And you see it in essentially, I've just kind of summarized all the different treaties here, or in organizations. And what happens is like tariffs generally drop, and like free trade is adopted as kind of like, hey, this is good for everybody, or not good, not everybody, but it's good at the country level. Um, Leads to growth. And so we have a drop in the average tariff of 22% to 5%. And this is kind of like the common, whatever, uh, common idea that is held by most developed countries until recently with Trump and the trade war. Um, and now there are other strains of thought that maybe there's a different way to develop with tariffs. This is actually common in Latin America in the 20th century. It's called import substitution industrialization. That theory is kind of like promoted by Raul Prebisch, and it's a massive failure in terms of promoting industrialization. As we'll go through this theory, it's not all rosy. There are certainly losers, but generally trade has induced growth throughout the 20th century. Okay, so let's look at the data. This is all from Our World in Data. Is the source for all these graphs. We have this massive expansion in trade, crazy in terms of the value of global exports. If you look at that, you might say, okay, that's just because the world has grown so much in this time period. So if you look at this as a percentage of world GDP, you see not quite as stark as a pattern, but you do see this kind of increase in global trade. And what's interesting is this is kind of our first era of globalization, and you see kind of because of this turn inward and the Great Depression and the World War II, it actually drops, but we really have this massive pickup in global trade in the back half of the 20th century going into this century. And the type of trade actually really changes. So most of this trade back here is between the rich countries, between your developed countries. That has really fallen as a share. And what has really grown is this non-rich to rich. And then, so that's trade from the developing world to the rich countries. So the importing of primary goods from developing countries to the rich countries, and then trade amongst the developing world. So non-rich to non-rich. So two developing countries trading with one another. So I think some of the narratives often is like, rich countries forcing their goods into poor countries, which would be the rich to non-rich, which was maybe some part of the trade back here. But in the present, really, this rise in trade is coming out of the developing world. Either to other developing countries or to the rich countries. Okay, so we have this comparative advantage theory, which kind of suggests, all right, everybody can be better off, at least at the country level. When we zoom in within a country, there's actually going to be some winners and losers, depending on if the country is an exporter or an importer within that industry. Now, economic theory would suggest if you kind of add up the gains and then subtract the losses, the gains will outweigh the losses. But we will get into the details of that later in the lecture. So for exported goods, if your country is an exporter, this is essentially going to be good for the producers. So the producers, okay, I'm exporting this good. I have access to this world market. That's going to be good for me. Now, your consumers may lose in this instance, in that they're going to face higher domestic prices for that particular good. If I'm an exporter and I can kind of send it to the rest of the world, I get to charge the world price, which is going to be higher usually than the domestic price. And so the domestic price will rise to match that world price. So consumers are going to lose in this case with the exporters. If a country is an exporter, the consumer will be the group that is potentially harmed. If you're an importer, this is the story that we are familiar with in the U.S., and this is the story typically that Trump will rail against. So The producers, if you're an importer, now the producers face this foreign competition. And so oftentimes they'll be put out of business, having to, face foreign competition from developing countries, which can pay lower wages, and thus, the domestic firms are often not competitive. And so the producers will often go out of business when they face these foreign imports. Now, consumers are helped by this. The consumers now pay lower prices. So if you're looking at the exporter, if you're an exporter, typically producers gain, consumers lose. Lose if you're looking at an imported good, typically producers lose, consumers gain. Now, if you go through the theory, the detail of the theory, you try to add up the gains versus the losses. As I mentioned, the gains will almost always outweigh the losses. And so, well, actually, we'll get to what should what happens in reality next. For now, we're doing the theory. So if you're anti-trade or you're skeptical of trade, don't worry, I'll get to that. But right now, we're doing trade's great. Okay, so we're doing the theory, and next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna watch a video that is like trumpeting the wonders of trade. But if you're skeptical, don't worry, stay tuned.